The rule of law. The rule of law is supposed to provide security for the United States. It's supposed to provide stability in both the domestic and the international space so that everybody knows the rules, everybody follows them. If you get outside the rules, you can count on somebody putting you back inside of them and keeping you safe, whether that's in American law, whether it's in international law. The idea is that everybody follows one set of rules/laws and that there's the possibility, anyway, of some kind of peace. And when people get outside those norms, then the international community will come together to try and put coerce and pressure to bring things back into stability so that everybody can have some kind of a prosperous life. That's the theory anyway. Sometimes it works, but then sometimes you get things out of whack, like you get a Hitler or Mao Zedong or somebody like that says, you know what, I don't care about the rule of law. I'm going to go in my own path here, and we're just going to rule by force of arms. And of course, we in the West have always said, oh, that's a terrible way. You can't. Oh, hang on. I'm sorry. It's just coming into me some information that apparently the United States is now throwing that in the trash. And we're going to talk today about what that may mean, how far this is going to go. Is it just an aberration? Is it just kind of Trump, quote, being Trump? Or should we be more worried about this? And to try to figure this out, because there's so much economically, domestically, internationally, and militarily involved with this, we have back with us today Colonel Douglas Macgregor, defense and foreign policy analyst, former advisor to the Secretary of Defense, and of course, highly decorated combat veteran. Doug, welcome to the show.
Well, it's great to be here, Dan.
Well, listen, great to have you in, and I'm really interested in your view on this because there is a significant change in the winds coming out of this whole situation with Venezuela, and actually you can see the seeds of this kind of starting to change, and the winds are starting to change even back into the early part of the Trump administration in this time, going back to May. We're going to get more on that in a minute, but I'm just kind of curious as to your thought right now when you see so many people, especially from the Republican Party, that are kind of bragging about how it's the law of the jungle, like that's a good thing.
Well, it's a little difficult to react in any way other than disappointed. What are we supposed to say? There has always been an element with President Trump that favors the application of force over negotiation, force over reason. If you go back and look at President Trump's background in the 80s and 90s especially, he's always been someone who thought that bullying and threatening was the way to achieve what you wanted in negotiations. I think some of this has to do with the New York real estate background. It's almost as though he wants people to fear him, and he presents this sort of gangster persona as a way to persuade them to fear him. Because I can tell you that President Trump is not the sort of person that if you met him and worked with him for any length of time in private, you would fear him as that sort of gangster-like figure. You know, there was an event in the early 90s where he was talking to some member of the State Department who happened to, he and this person happened to find each other. I've forgotten the circumstances. But the man said, well, Bob over here is going to be negotiating with the Russians on intermediate range nuclear weapons, something like that. And Trump was fascinated, said, oh, really? He's going to do that? And he said, well, I have some advice for him. He said, well, he's right over here. Why don't you go talk with him? So we went over there, and what was reported subsequently from the conversation was that he said, what you need to do when you see that Russian, you need to go right over to him as soon as you walk in the room before anything is said and grab him by the collar and tell him, screw you. Of course, he was less polite. He didn't use the word screw. And on the assumption that this is how you handle them, you just go right up into their faces and you push them and you tell them, screw you, I'm in charge. Well, obviously that didn't happen, and the negotiations proceeded, and we did conclude a favorable agreement. I've forgotten on which facet of arms control it was. I think that's Donald Trump, frankly, and his belief in these tactics. That's all. That's the only thing I can say.
And let's actually get into what some of those tactics and how they're manifesting right now. This whole situation with Venezuela, of course, has all been in the news. Everybody's been talking about it. We went in there, we did the snatch and grab, and a lot of people have been talking about the operation itself, and we might get into that in a minute here. But I want to focus on what has happened since and where this is going to go. Secretary Rubio yesterday went out in front of the cameras along with Secretary Hegseth, and they said basically there are two objectives of this Venezuelan ops.
As you've seen today, 2 more ships were seized. We are in the midst right now and, in fact, about to execute on a deal to take all the oil. They have oil that is stuck in Venezuela. They can't move it because of our quarantine and because it's sanctioned. We are going to take between 30 and 50 million barrels of oil. We're going to sell it in the marketplace at market rates, not at the discounts Venezuela was getting. That money will then be handled in such a way that we will control how it is dispersed in a way that benefits the Venezuelan people, not corruption, not the regime. So we have a lot of leverage to move on the stabilization front. The second phase will be a phase that we call recovery, and that is ensuring that American, Western, and other companies have access to the Venezuelan market in a way that's fair. Also, at the same time, begin to create the process of reconciliation nationally within Venezuela.
Okay, so those seem to be two kind of strange things to put together. We're going to, number one, we're going to take their oil, we're going to use it how we see fit. And then the second thing is this is nation building. We're going to start telling them how to change their terms inside and bring all this democracy into place. I mean, let's take those in order. What do you think, first of all, about what justification can we use that has any plausible international acceptance or legality to just take the oil, especially when you're talking, I'm just going to now go and get this amount of oil and we're going to spend it how we see fit, and we'll let you know how it turns out?
Well, the answer to that is there is none. But I don't think it makes any difference to anybody in Washington. And we might as well come to terms with that reality. If we're going to sit around and talk about the legalistic aspects of this whole business, it's going to be a very short conversation. None of it is legal. We don't even have a declared war. In other words, there's nothing from the Hill that says, we support intervention in Venezuela and we're giving the president authorization to do it and we're backing whatever he wants. The Hill doesn't seem to care. The Hill wasn't asked. And when you start talking about dispersing funds, I'm sure all of these donors that are in the background that are lining up to pick up the pieces of whatever falls out of the basket of goodies from Venezuela will have something to say about that. So.
And now what about the second part of it? Because do you think that when Rubio's talking about, we're going to do democracy and stuff, is that just a sop to people who say, oh, well, you don't care about the people, you just care about the oil, but we're going to get into democracy? Because that is like, we tried that in Iraq. We've tried that in other places, and it spectacularly backfired. Do you think that the administration is actually going to try to invest capital, political capital and otherwise, into trying to reshaping Venezuela from the inside?
If all the concern about the Venezuelan people, unfortunately, I think to some extent also the American people, but certainly the Venezuelan people, were flatulence, it wouldn't stink up a broom closet. So that's all nonsense. I wouldn't pay any attention to it at all. These people are trying to dress up whatever they say or do in clothing and language that's going to appeal to people. And you do that by invoking human rights, freedom, democracy, all the usual things. Hasn't got anything to do with it. You can go all the way back to World War I. This was the crusade for democracy in the war to end all wars. That was all nonsense. It had much more to do with the interests of the banking community and the possibility, very high probability at that point, that the British and the French would lose and we'd lose all the money that we'd invested in them. This is nonsense. So I wouldn't pay any attention to any of it at all.
But do you think that we're going to try to do? Because if we make some efforts, it's just not going to go well. Or do you think that it literally is just verbal and we won't actually even make an attempt to do it, and Venezuela rules themselves however they want to? What do you expect to happen?
Well, maybe somebody will say, let's go to the barrio that's on the west side of Caracas and build a child care center. And we'll have Secretary Rubio show up to dedicate the child care center. In the meantime, what else are we doing? Doesn't make any difference. I don't want to sound too cynical, but we got to be realistic. It's all nonsense. It's just crap.
Yeah, and I hope that version is what comes out, because if we get this idea that no, we're different. This crew in the White House is different than the Bush or Obama or all these other folks who tried to do it. They just messed it up, but we know how to do it. I hope that's not the case, although I'm not convinced it's not, because I do think that there's a lot of arrogance that we're different than everybody else and we can do stuff that they failed to do. Do you have any concerns about that?
Well, we've always argued that. That was true in 1965 when we went to Vietnam. It's been true every time we've gone anywhere to do anything. We said that about both world wars. We said it about the Korean conflict at the time. Actually speaking, we did the best we could under the circumstances in Korea, but we recognized the most important thing was to end the war and stop the killing because we couldn't reverse everything. That was a different time with a different president who understood what he was doing. I think the people in charge right now are in their own world. And it's not just President Trump. It's the entire Washington community. Everyone is living in their own kind of fantasy world where you can print as much money as you want, push the button again, go to the repo window, refund or fund private equity, pay off your donors with all sorts of opportunities to get control of the remains of the prostrate, dying Ukraine, or now pick up whatever is available that could be stolen from Venezuela. This is just the way we do business. It's tragic. It's despicable. It's not the first time in history, won't be the last. But I think this time we're in a lot of trouble because we don't have the financial wherewithal and the stable economic foundation that we once did. I think that's ultimately going to shut us down.
Now, I want to go down that path. You said a second ago about not just Trump, but it's about the administration and other figures that are in there. Because you gave that anecdote a minute ago. You said that about Trump in the past, about the negotiations, grabbing by the collar and all that. So that would almost imply that that's kind of what the plan was, that he has an idea of what he wants to get done here. So I want to look at a specific aspect of this whole regime change things, which obviously we just executed pretty profoundly in Caracas. Now, Trump ran in both 2016 and in 2024 on no stupid wars, getting out of the wars that we were in, no regime change. By very specifically, he said that repeatedly. Then he gets into office, and several people did say that too. In fact, most recently in October, Tulsi Gabbard went out and said it's American policy. We don't do regime change. We're not in that anymore. Things are a little different now. But I want to take a look here specifically about what Trump said in May of last year in Riyadh, to where he really kind of threw a lot of cold water on all the efforts of the past and shown how he was going to be different. Watch this.
The gleaming marvels of Riyadh and Abu Dhabi were not created by the so-called nation builders, neocons, or liberal nonprofits like those who spent trillions and trillions of dollars failing to develop Kabul, Baghdad, so many other cities. Instead, the birth of a modern Middle East has been brought by the people of the region themselves, the people that are right here, the people that have lived here all their lives, developing your own sovereign countries, pursuing your own unique visions and charting your own destinies in your own way. It's really incredible what you've done. In the end, the so-called nation builders wrecked far more nations than they built, and the interventionists were intervening in complex societies that they did not even understand themselves. They told you how to do it, but they had no idea how to do it themselves. Peace, prosperity, and progress ultimately came not from a radical rejection of your heritage, but rather from embracing your national traditions and embracing that same heritage that you love so dearly.
So which Trump should we believe? The one who was saying that back then, the one who said in the election campaign that no more regime change, or the one that's now bragging about stealing the Ukrainian oil or the Venezuelan oil?
Well, I think you have to listen carefully to what he says. First of all, the portions that are about liberal interventionism and the nonprofits, which are scams and many of which are CIA fronts and so forth, all of that failed. All of the changes designed to fundamentally alter these societies, their values, their way of life, and so forth, of course that failed. But now it seems as though he's turning to this billionaire class of vulture capitalists who somehow or another are going to bring prosperity, goodwill, and hope to the rest of the world. And that's what he represents, the billionaire vulture capitalists, the financial capitalists that surround him in the White House, the financial capitalists that run Washington right now. In other words, you're not talking about Andrew Carnegie or J.D. Rockefeller or the people that built railroads, the people that built steel factories, the people that created businesses, Edison and so forth. We're not talking about people like that. We're talking about financial capitalists. They don't build anything. They manipulate money. And in the process of manipulating money and collecting transaction fees, they don't give a damn about the people whose businesses they buy, subsequently dissect, divide up amongst themselves and resell at great profit. These are the people that are running the show in Washington. So on the one hand, he's telling you the truth about what's happened in the past. Now he's also by implication telling you, yeah, everything's going to change, but none of it's going to be good for anybody except us. And he takes the position that it doesn't matter. The problem with him is that the enrichment of everything takes place in the top 1% to 5% for Donald Trump. That's the problem. The rest of the country gets nothing, profits in no way. And that's why I said the notion that somehow or another the Venezuelan people are going to awaken to a new dawn that we're going to provide to them is absurd. Instead, what you're going to get is the other scenario. They're not going to get anything except what we decide to give them, and it'll come in the form of a little child care center that Marco Rubio dedicates. That's the sort of nonsense we're dealing with. Now, the problem is this. You can't just print money in perpetuity. And they've now adopted the position that says, oh, yes, we can. Just watch us. We're going to do that. There are too many forces in the world operating against us. There are too many people outside the United States that now know we're a dangerous, infected being as a nation state from the financial economic standpoint. People are moving away from us. People are doing business in yuan, business in other currencies. They don't want to do business with the United States if they can avoid it. If they have to, they'll do it, but they don't want to do business in dollars anymore. And so with each passing day, fewer and fewer people are doing business in dollars. We're on the road to isolation. It's funny, people that talk about isolationism. Isolationism historically in the United States was about staying out of other people's wars. It had nothing to do with business or commerce. But we're moving down a road that's going to isolate us from the supply chains, which are migrating in the direction of China and away from us. These are the things that we should be focused on, but we're not, because for the moment, we're going to use our military power as we see fit to pursue our agenda. Now, the rest of that equation, though, consists of the following. At some point, China, Russia, and potentially other countries are going to say, now that's enough. We don't know when that point is going to be reached or how it will be reached. But we do know that in light of this most recent event in the Atlantic Ocean with the empty oil tanker that we decided we had to own or steal or whatever, and sent the U.S. Coast Guard out to capture it. Now the Russians are sending nuclear submarines and surface combatants into the Atlantic and headed for Venezuela. That's a bad thing. In fact, that's the opposite of what President Trump says he wants. He wants everybody who is not American out of the Western Hemisphere. But in reality, he seems to be creating conditions where we're likely to see the very thing we don't want. The people need to stop and consider for a second, Dan. When we went through the Cuban Missile Crisis, we quarantined Cuba, and you heard Secretary Rubio use that term for Venezuela. They don't like to say embargo. They don't like to say naval blockade, so they say quarantine, remember?
Yeah.
And, we quarantined Cuba for a very good reason. There were theater ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads aimed at the United States sitting on the ground in Cuba. Now stop and consider that. That justified a massive military response to what was happening in Cuba. And the Russians understood that. And ultimately, the Russians wisely withdrew. We made an agreement with them that we would remove similar missiles from Turkey, which were aimed at Russia. Very wise and intelligent thing for us to do. We've thrown all of that rationality out of the window. We are focusing on Venezuela for a whole range of reasons. I mean, the administration has got a list of these things. It's not just oil. It's not just rare earths. It's not just drugs. There are all sorts of things driving this. But what we're losing sight of is this notion that Venezuela, whatever it is no threat to us. So the justification for the massive use of military power to do all of the things we're doing isn't there. So set aside whether or not it's legal, because nobody cares. It's irrelevant. Let's look at the rationality of this whole thing. The strategic rationale doesn't make sense. We can deal with all of the issues that are on this long list without employing vast quantities of military power. It's not necessary.
It's not necessary, but as you say, that it's pushing people back in a direction that is antithetical to our medium and long-term interest, I believe. And all the things that happened in Venezuela with the snatch and grab and all the things we're doing with this, taking with this oil, that's all bad. But what, in my view, makes it worse is the reaction this is getting and the cheerleading this is getting within the Republican Party. And far from calling out the president, far from saying, hey, this is going in a direction we don't want to go. Like you just said, there's a better way to accomplish our objectives and to increase the capabilities of the United States than this path. Here it is. Instead, they're doing, more of that. Here is Rep. Andy Ogles actually saying, you know what? We are the biggest guy on the block.
It's important that we have a stake in Greenland, that they are quite frankly a protectorate of the United States and not, they've been in participation or a relationship with Denmark. That needs to end. Denmark, we have spilt more blood. The United States of America has spilt more blood protecting Greenland than the Danes have. We have a greater vested interest in Greenland than, geographically speaking, than the Denmark, the Danes have. And so when you look at the Monroe Doctrine, when you look at the Western Hemisphere, we are the dominant predator, quite frankly, force in the Western Hemisphere. And that speaks to Venezuela, where I'll take odds with Senator Paul, my friend, quite frankly, is that, you had a dictator who was poisoning and killing Americans. And the president of the United States has sent a clear message. If you were complicit in killing Americans, we are going to come for you.
Okay, I'm going to get to that last part he said there in a minute. If you're doing drugs and harming America, we're coming after you. But I want to focus in on that first part there. He outright said, not that we're the dominant military power, but we're the dominant military predator. And of course, that was all in the ideas, not just in the Venezuela, but also in telling Europe, our allies, that if we see that we want over there in Greenland, we'll take that too. And we're the predator. What does that tell the rest of the world, Doug? Allies and adversaries alike?
Well, I think it's an unambiguous signal that, quite frankly, we don't respect anyone's national sovereignty if it's inconvenient for us to do so. If we find it convenient to seize something, whether it's property that is owned by another country or private property owned by persons who may or may not be Americans, whatever it turns out to be, territory and otherwise, we're simply going to act in what we think is our own best national interest. Now, I think this is very important, because if you're a European and you have been deluding yourselves all these years to believe that the United States is an altruistic power that commits armed forces to the ground in Europe to help the Europeans protect themselves against external threats, well, then you'd better wake up and discover that, no, that's not the case. The United States has reasons for being in Europe that have nothing to do with your interests at all. And perhaps you may want to rethink your relationship with America. Now, you know my position. I think the best thing for the Europeans would have been for us to Europeanize NATO and gradually disengage, certainly after 1992-93. There was no reason for us to stay and maintain these large troop deployments. Okay, that wasn't popular. We didn't want to leave. That we viewed Europe then privately as part of our greater global empire. Well, now the Europeans need to ask the question, do we really want these people inside our country any longer? I think the Koreans and the Japanese have already answered this question. They'd like us to leave. The Koreans have said so privately to us. They want us out. We need to get out. The Japanese haven't said it yet. They're being polite, and they're going to probably milk us for whatever benefits they can get for their own military power. But at some point, they're going to say enough, and I think that's close. So we need to get out of a number of these places for those reasons, but it would also be nice for us to leave before we're thrown out. All I think we're doing at this point is guaranteeing that we will be thrown out. Now, if we go to this Greenland thing, what that man doesn't understand is that certainly since 1945, we've dominated the strategic high ground in Alaska, Canada, Greenland, Norway, all the way to the borders with Russia. I mean, what does the man think we're doing? Why did we build submarines to sail under the Arctic ice packs? He doesn't seem to understand that we were the first to successfully sail under all of these ice packs with our submarines. We are a dominant maritime power in the Western Hemisphere, and certainly in the Arctic, and have been for a very long time. So the notion that we have to suddenly take ownership, physical ownership of Greenland to be strategically safe and secure is absurd. And Denmark is a small nation. Historically, you can make the argument that all of the Germanic countries, Scandinavia, the Netherlands, all should have long since been coalesced into a greater Germany. Everybody will be shocked. Oh, that's terrible. But that's probably what should have happened historically in Europe. Europe is too fragmented. It consists of little tribal entities that have essentially masqueraded as viable states. They're not. So there has to be a certain amount of cross-border integration and coalescing go on in Europe. Well, it hasn't happened. Maybe once we get out, we'll see some of that occur. There was always an argument that you needed to bring like peoples together into a larger entity, whether they were Slavs or Germanic or something else. It was a matter of security and well-being. Well, it didn't happen. And it was convenient for us that they remained small, divided, and incapable. And guess what? They are small, divided, and incapable. We've succeeded. The question is, what will they do now? And I think President Trump is simply helping them to make some tough decisions. And those tough decisions are going to be made over the next few years.
Now, I want to look at a couple of different aspects of this situation here. One, on the physical capacity of the U.S. to be this predator that Oogles was talking about. And then number two, I guess the moral/legal argument that many people still use as what they think the world should be like, or what they want the world to be like. First of all, on the capability. At the end of that statement there, Representative Oogles, that I just played here, said, this is about the drugs. This is about keeping America safe. And anybody who comes out against the United States, you can be guaranteed that Trump's going to take them out. Now, the situation with Venezuela, as we've said many times, primarily most of the drugs they make actually end up going to Europe, and very few come to the United States. But okay, whatever, we'll just take their argument at face value on that for the moment. But then everybody has said in conjunction with that, but the biggest violator is Colombia, because that's where the fentanyl comes in, which is the biggest killer in the United States. And of course, Trump said that the president of Venezuela, of Colombia, better watch his ass, and he could be next and all that, until he posts this last night when President Trump says, it was a great honor to speak with the president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, who called to explain the situation of drugs and other disagreements we have had. I appreciate his call and tone and look forward to meeting him in the near future. Arrangements are being made between Secretary of State Marco Rubio and their foreign minister. The meeting will take place in the White House in Colombia. So all that he said about that, okay, everything's cool now. He's going to come over. Well, unless something magically happened that all these drugs stopped, nothing should have caused President Trump to say that. If lion's share of all the illegal drugs came from Colombia, this makes it look pretty much like, yeah, it's really not that. So one has to wonder, by the way, the New York Times published this piece, I think it's today, that said that, by the way, it was Trump that initiated that call. And I wonder, and I want your view on this, going in and having this snatch and grab against Maduro is one thing. And there's evidence that we had a double agent inside, and a lot of things went our way. But the idea that we can use military power against Colombia, I think is a very, very different thing, especially with this roughly 18,000 people we have in the area right now. Do you think that there's a possibility that Trump realizes that we're not really this 800-pound gorilla and we can do anything that we want at no cost, and that we really can't go in to have a war with Colombia without great cost to us? What do you think?
First of all, we need to understand something. The CIA has a major role to play in all this drug trafficking, and always has. I don't know all of the details, but you can talk to John Kiriakou and a host of other people and they will tell you how deeply involved the CIA is in drug trafficking. So when you start talking about stopping it, you probably ought to start at home with the Central Intelligence Agency. If you're a Russian or you're Chinese, you know that the CIA is subsidizing and pushing heroin in great quantities from Afghanistan into Central Asia. And that heroin finds its way now into China as well as into Russia. It's an enormous problem for them, as well as into Eastern Europe and Turkey. So we are heavily engaged in inflicting enormous damage on others with the use of drugs. I think we have to understand that as far as Colombia is concerned, what Trump really wants is somebody to say, yes, sir, we'll do whatever you want. And I think that's probably what the president of Colombia said privately. You know, what do you want us to do? And I think Trump is satisfied with that. He's satisfied with somebody taking the oath of allegiance to him. That's the way he thinks. If you know how to flatter his ego, if you know how to make him feel important, reinforce his view of himself and the world that he lives in, I think you can get a long way. So it's not a question, does he suddenly recognize limitations to his power? No, I don't think so. I think he feels his power is almost limitless. By the way, I really wish that Republican, instead of talking about international affairs about which he and most of his colleagues know absolutely nothing, he ought to stand behind Kristi Noem and the Department of Homeland Security and the terrible outcry against ICE. You know, I'm tired of hearing about ICE agents or terrorists and all this. It's crap. We need to enforce federal law. Congress needs to enforce federal law. They need to get behind federal law enforcement. If we don't do that, the country we have will go out of existence. It won't make any difference what happens in Venezuela or China or Iran or Israel or anywhere else. But the people on the Hill, I think they have other interests, and they don't seem to be very focused on what's really important to Americans.
Well, I think that is very much validated by what we see coming out of the Hill, because they seem pretty gleeful on not worrying about the rule of law and about dominating his power. If President Trump may or may not recognize there are limits to the power, if you're right and he doesn't, nobody on the Hill thinks there's any limits to power. And so they are now gleefully talking about, let's just eliminate even the pretense that we're following international law, and let's embrace the law of the jungle.
When people start saying international law, it's against international law, you know that they have no other recourse, because there really is no international law.
There's no international law that holds us back, because international law is fake.
We live in a world that is governed by strength, that is governed by force, that is governed by power.
Every once in a while, we got to send a bunch of commandos to kick in your door and drag you into a helicopter in the middle of the night in handcuffs. And if that violates international law, well, find someone else to enforce it.
We are the dominant predator, quite frankly, force in the Western Hemisphere.
There is no such thing as international law. It is nonsense. You know what international law really is? Law of the jungle.
There is no such thing as international law. What rules the world and has ruled humanity is the law of the jungle. We rule the jungle. We are the lion.
So when people hear that outside of the United States, they're saying you're not even pretending to, not even putting window dressing on rule of law. It's all about rule of jungle. And you say you're the lion and you can do whatever you want. What kind of reaction do you think that's going to have internationally? You can just, I mean, I would like you to look at three different areas: one China, one Russia, and then one even our allies in Europe. How are they going to react to that?
Well, we're confirming everybody's worst suspicions about us. That's very straightforward. The notion of international law being irrelevant appeals in a lot of ways, because it suggests that there are no rules. And if there are no rules, then you're free to do as you wish. But in truth, historically, when you had Pax Britannica, when you had Pax Romana, you did have rules. And these rules were widely embraced and respected. The British Empire created order around the globe. Now, were they all Boy Scouts and Eagle Scouts and so forth? Of course not. We know that. And they managed to steal a great deal of wealth from a number of places and enrich Great Britain. We understand that as well. But they were also much more honest about it. I think the only thing that has changed at this point is that we're dropping the pretense that we're really interested in anybody. In other words, what you heard from Secretary Rubio at the beginning, which was designed to put a happy face on the dead rat, now you're hearing from everybody else the truth, which is we don't care what anybody thinks. We don't care what anybody else's interests are. And we're going to use our military power as we see fit. Problem is, as we said before, the economic foundations of our military power are very weak. We no longer have the manufacturing base that we once did. And if we think that we can bully everybody everywhere all the time, eventually we will discover that everyone everywhere is against us. In other words, it's Newtonian physics. If you press hard against something, the something will press back against you. And that's what's going to happen. It's already begun. And I really worry about it because we are so deluded about the limits or the limitless quality of our power and influence that I think we've lost our fear of real war. You and I have talked about this many, many times. It's easy to be a congressman or a news anchor or a talking head and cheer on what we did to the Venezuelan government, which was essentially take two people out. By the way, we did not affect regime change in Venezuela. The old regime is still there. That's the problem right now. And that's the problem that Rubio and Trump and Hegseth and everybody else are wrestling with, because the only way to get rid of that is to go in on the ground. If you go in on the ground, that's like walking into the world's largest ambush. It's a huge tar pit. You'll go in there and you'll probably change nothing of value and end up spending huge quantities of money, which is what we've discovered elsewhere. So you haven't really changed the regime. All you've done is remove the top stratum of leadership. But the new leadership that is there came up under the previous leadership. So fundamentally, what do you think you've really changed? Well, then we get into this game about resources. We're going to control the oil. And if we control the oil, we control everything in Venezuela. Well, that's been tried before. I don't think it'll work very well. That's one of the reasons they nationalized it and threw out all the oil corporations, because they discovered that the Venezuelan people were being cut out of the equation. They weren't getting anything out of it. They weren't profiting. And I very seriously doubt that anybody that is currently interested in going into Venezuela and extracting oil gives a damn what happens to the Venezuelan people. I think that's all window dressing, as we've discussed. Bottom line is, if you push hard enough, long enough, you're going to get the war you don't want against the alliance of nations that you can't defeat. I think we're on that path.
Yeah, I do. I fear that too. And I want to go down. I'm going to continue on that path in a second, but I want to peer off just a second on something you just said there. These oligarchs that President Trump is dealing with, and especially these oil company executives that he says he already talked to 20 of them, with a bunch of people ready to go into Venezuela. But as you just mentioned, there is some history there during the past and in other countries too about nationalizing products. These guys have to think, and just take morality out of the equation here. They have to think, okay, Trump has 3 years left in here. I mean, I think you can forget about this whole idea he's going to run in 2028. I don't think his health will even allow it if he gets to 2028, just frankly speaking. But whatever, at some point, he's not going to be in office. And who knows who would follow him next, whether it's a Democrat or just some other Republican, or there's financial problems. And so anybody who goes in there now and invests a bunch of money, by all estimates, it's somewhere between 7 and 10 year prospect, $100 billion, maybe more, of consistent infrastructure building and investment, et cetera, before they can really start to get a return on investment, at which time Trump won't be there to keep going down this. And so they would have to be thinking, we're going to be risking a lot and Trump won't be in there in the future. Are they going to be willing to risk that much money going in and to actually do this?
Well, I think President Trump has already answered that question by telling the oil companies that we will, in fact, pay for everything at the outset. In other words, this is the game. We're going to pump billions of dollars into the oil companies so that they can go into Venezuela, repair everything, and get everything running again. And eventually, that's the key word, eventually, the revenues from the oil will come back to the United States and reimburse the government, the taxpayer, for all of the billions that we've invested in the oil corporations. Well, that sounds a lot like land in Florida and the Brooklyn Bridge to me. And I think we've been down that road before. We made similar promises about Iraq. They never came to fruition. I think the president and his cabinet is desperate. I think they know they've got a serious problem right now. They really haven't changed anything of substance yet in Venezuela. They removed Maduro and his wife. That's all. So what has changed in Venezuela? Answer, nothing. And how much do you think you can change? Do you think you can waltz into the place, start repairing oil infrastructure and drilling for oil with impunity? I have real doubts about that. What do you think is going to protect you in Lake Maracaibo if the locals decide to blow up your oil rig? What's going to protect you in the Orinoco Basin if you come under assault and attack? Or if you try to go back and reinvigorate the gold mining, the emerald mines, or extract rare earths. I mean, this is a big place. There are almost 30 million people living in that country. You got a lot of enemies right now. Remember, hundreds of thousands of people in the so-called People's Militia are armed. They're out there with weapons. They're not innocuous. You're not walking into Montgomery County, Maryland. I'm sorry, you're not taking over McLean in Virginia. It's a very different environment. It is the jungle. So you think you've conquered the jungle? Go into the jungle and see how well that works out for you. These things haven't been addressed, Dan, and they're trying to figure it out. And you know what? It's not going to work. In fact, it's not going to work to the point where it may be that in a few weeks we'll be so embroiled in the Middle East with Iran that nobody will even talk about Venezuela anymore.
Yeah, that's a big concern that I have. But I wanted to get back to the fallout and what others are thinking. I mentioned the adversaries, both China, Russia, and in our allies in Europe. All that's kind of playing in here. This is a video made, I think it was today, at least it was published today, by General Abti Aludinov of Russia. He's the guy that was in charge of driving the Ukrainians out of Kursk region when they went in 2024, I think it was when they went in. And he says, hey, look, Trump is now just taking off the mask.
He has decided to go on the offensive, dropping all masks. Masks dropped, which means he has begun openly insulting our country, our leadership. Today, a Russian tanker was seized. So, he says he controls this on a whim, that no one will do anything there without his knowledge. And, of course, the question arises of how we will respond to these people, because we ourselves will probably respond in some way. And here, of course, I want to say these words. I will fully support any decisions made by the Supreme Commander-in-Chief. I believe that, with his wisdom, he will make decisions that will reflect the actions of our enemies, who have thrown off their masks and revealed their true faces. And, of course, I want the people of our country to understand that no one is going to make peace with us. As long as Russia exists, they will always fight against us.
So he's saying, yeah, he's almost saying the same thing, it kind of in a different way, that all these Republicans and all these talking heads I showed a minute ago were saying, yeah, there's no more law, so it's the rule of the jungle. Well, there's other animals besides the lion in the jungle, and Russia may say the same thing and start taking action, especially now that you're talking about we started taking some of these tankers. Ukraine has attacked some Russian tankers. Where do you see that going?
Well, first of all, I would urge everyone that watched that interview to go back and see it again. Ludinov, who is the Akhmat commander, is exceptionally intelligent, very, very competent, and he represents Russia in a very important way. Look at the flags that stand behind him. On the one side, you have the Islamic symbol, the crescent moon, the green flag. On the other, you have the Russian national flag. This man is fiercely supportive of and is willing to die for the Russian state. But the Russian state of which he is a part is also partially Islamic. He's coming from an Islamic state, Chechnya, that is fundamentally different from the rest of Russia. But they are fiercely loyal to and part of Russia. Now, I want to bring that up because this man is saying things that Vladimir Putin would say. And he represents a version of Russia that is very strong, very cohesive, and very effective. Much more cohesive socially, I would say, in societal terms, than our own country right now. So just bear that in mind and go back and look at this. Look at those flags and understand you're listening to a man who is a Chechen who is speaking flawless, perfect Russian. But he represents the Russian people. He represents Chechnya. He represents the Russian state and the Russian military, all bound into one entity. Very, very important. By the way, his influence reaches far beyond the borders of Russia, reaches all the way to Syria, reaches into the Caucasus. He has entree in all of these places because he is a Muslim, and he is a Turkic Muslim, a Chechen, but he represents Russia. I mean, these are very important facts that we tend to overlook. He has entree to Pakistan, into Afghanistan, into East Turkestan, which the Chinese call Xinjiang. So I guess what I'm trying to get people to understand, he's a very powerful figure. And he's saying something that's very true. The Russians will respond asymmetrically. Now, what do we mean about asymmetry? We are primarily an air or aerospace and maritime power. That's what we are. We have a bad habit of flying in, sailing in, doing things, flying out, sailing out, without consequences, without responsibility for the damage that we've inflicted. That was the problem in World War I. We were there long enough to tip the balance in favor of the British and the French, and then we packed it in and left. After World War II, our damage was so severe, or stupidly handled, that we had destroyed both Germany and Japan, the only forces at that point that were capable of counterbalancing the Soviet Union. So we had to stay. And that cost us a lot of time and money and opportunity. We are not seen as a positive force because we are a temporary resident. We don't live there. It goes back to what Charles de Gaulle said to everybody about America's leadership of NATO. He said, everybody needs to understand something. Americans do not live in Europe, and Britain is an island. And he was talking about Europe, essentially from the Atlantic to the Urals. And everybody sort of criticized and poured buckets of filth and abuse all over de Gaulle. De Gaulle was right. That's where Europe is now. Europe is figuring out Charles de Gaulle was right. Absolutely spot on. Britain is still a menace because it doesn't bring anything to the Europeans. It's another disruptive influence. It's very much like us, and we are very much like them. So the whole problem that we're dealing with right now is this unfortunate ability, this Anglo-American ability to move in, temporarily change things, influence things, and then when things don't go our way, what do? We pull the plug, we get out. And we act as though we are godlike because of the ability to come and go. The Russians are going to respond asymmetrically. That means there are going to be financial and economic measures taken against us. And when the opportunity presents itself on their turf, that is on Chinese and Russian turf, and that turf extends all the way into Central and Southeast Asia, it extends into the Middle East, it extends into Europe. When that opportunity presents itself to do us harm, they will do us serious harm. And we are grossly underestimating the ability of these places and these states and these people to do us serious harm. It's a big mistake. Finally, unlike the British, who at least until World War I were reasonably rational, and they understood the criticality of behaving well, in other words, being polite and treating others well if they could. Palmerston used to say, the British Empire has no permanent enemies or friends, only permanent interests. We're very similar, but we need to define the interests. And what Donald Trump has done and what all of those foolish people that you listened to earlier have done is define the interests as being the world. The world is our playground. We can do as we wish. No one can stop us. We're the biggest, baddest animal in the jungle. Well, as soon as you say that, you're wrong. And it's only a question of time until that redounds to our disadvantage. Somebody said, cast your bread upon the waters, and in a few days it will return to you manyfold. Watch the ocean. A lot of bad things are going to come our way as a result of all this behavior.
Yeah, and I in the remainder of the time that we have here, I want to pivot over to Europe, and I want to touch on, before we let you go, the big meeting that happened in Paris here a couple of days ago where Zelensky met, Witkoff was there, Kushner was there. They were talking about business situations, and everybody's coming to this situation where they claim Witkoff afterwards, and many of the British and French leaders were claiming afterwards, we are so close to having a peace deal here, more than 90% of the way there. That's what they said at their celebration and post-meeting press conferences, etc. Well, today, Friedrich Merz had a rare moment of actually telling the truth about what was or what wasn't accomplished in Paris.
Die Reihenfolge muss sein, erst ein Waffenstillstand, dann Sicherheitsgarantien für die Ukraine, für ein langfristiges Abkommen mit Russland. Und das Ganze geht eben nicht ohne die Zustimmung Russlands, und von der sind wir vermutlich immer noch ziemlich weit entfernt.
But yeah, no kidding. You're a long way from there if the Russians aren't on board, and they're not on board with any of those things. What is the whole purpose of this made-for-TV show you're seeing right here in front of us, when everybody knew going into that if the Russians aren't there and they're not on board with the things that they are clearly not, then there's no point in these efforts. What was it all about?
You said it right up front, a made-for-TV show. This was designed to convince the European peoples of the moral superiority of their leaders. We're the moral guys. We're trying to bring this to an end. And we won an agreement, and we're willing to do all of these things. And there was no mention of Russia or Russia's legitimate national security interests, no mention of the reality on the ground, on the battlefield, and the military balance. All of those things were ignored until Merz makes a statement. We want a long-term solution, but without Russia's support, without Russia's acknowledgement, none of this matters. Well, he's right. But we made lots of agreements. We signed lots of things. We had wonderful photo ops. And that made people feel good, particularly at the top. It created the illusion of something useful occurring. It's all irrelevant. Makes no difference whatsoever. It's sort of like the war on drugs. Remember that? Yeah, that was so incredibly successful, wasn't it? And was anybody ever really serious about it? Well, we can spend hours on that topic. But what are we talking about around the world? We want to stop all these drugs that are entering our country. But what are we doing to other people's countries? How are we involved in the drug trafficking, human trafficking in other places? Nobody wants to go there. The Central Intelligence Agency is an independent rogue agency. Is anybody talking about bringing that under control? No, in fact, they're singing the CIA's theme song, which is, it's the jungle, and we like the jungle. And we can dominate the jungle. Just give us more money and we'll continue to dominate the jungle. And that's where it is with the defense budget. You know, Donald Trump thinks his special ops operation is a reflection of our larger military power. We're the best. Nobody can stop us. Nobody can contradict us. But we all know, Dan, that that's not true. Military power is far-reaching. It involves everything from the manufacturing base, the surge capability it brings, to the millions of people who serve in it, and what kind of people they are, what kind of training they've got, what kind of leadership they've got, what kind of technology they can employ. All this is a very large issue. What we've seen in Ukraine is war, real, honest to God war. And we're not paying much attention to it. You know, if you tried to fly any of those helicopters in the Special Operations Aviation Regiment across the Ukrainian battlefield, nobody would have ever been seen again. We're talking about very fragile entities in the Special Ops Committee. Anybody with any experience in special operations will be honest with you. They'll explain that, you know, unless you can guarantee the following conditions: perfect intelligence, absolute clearance through the area where no one is going to interfere with what we're bringing in. No one has air and missile defense capabilities aimed at us, and we're not being detected, and on and on and on. We can't go. They'll tell you that flat out. There's a big difference between what you and I did and what happens in special operations. No one said to us, well, we want you to go do X, Y, and Z. And we said, okay, we'll go do X, Y, and Z. We understand the mission. And then we all got together and said, but we can't go unless we know exactly where the enemy is. And we have perfect conditions, perfect weather, perfect this. No, that's not war. You get a mission, you got to go. It doesn't make a damn bit of difference to the people at the top. We've got to go out and accomplish the mission. And by the way, we know we're going to lose people. And that's part of the other problem. There is no victory without sacrifice. And we are convincing large numbers of people that with these technologies, these unique capabilities that reside in these boutique forces, that we can get away with murder, literally, and no one will be hurt. That's dangerous. That's wrong. It's misleading. But all of these, what's the right word? Delusions are self-sustaining and inextricably intertwined, and they're very difficult to defeat. People latch onto these beliefs and they just can't give them up. I mean, look, go back and look at the Prince of Wales and the cruiser that accompanied it to Singapore. And all the admirals tried to tell Winston Churchill, if you send these battleships to Singapore without adequate air cover, the Japanese will probably sink them. And he was convinced that they were unsinkable anyway, and that couldn't happen because he was a product of the First World War. He was a product of an age where the battleship was powerful and supreme. What did we discover? Well, the admirals warned him, and they were right. And both of those enormous combat ships were lost. My point is that we don't want to do business that way in the future. And unfortunately, these kinds of things create these illusions. These illusions are hard to defeat in the future. And so what's the answer? Well, let's spend another $5 trillion or whatever it turns out, $500 billion on defense. And then we'll have even better stuff. And we can do this to our heart's content forever. But again, investing in defense and extracting real warfighting capability are not the same. It never has been. It never will be.
And in part of that delusion here in the Russia-Ukraine war, I mean, this was an effective made-for-TV moment because it got its near-term objective of making the people think, the things are positive, moving direction. We're doing something, et cetera. But as you just pointed out there, it was all window dressing. So Russia does seem to be focused on the reality on the ground, and they continue to move to the West. What do you think is going to happen here in 2026 as we move now past the made-for-TV moment and we stay on the hardcore ground?
The real danger for us is that now President Putin and his colleagues have essentially flipped the switch, and they are no longer listening to anything we say. They no longer trust us. I mean, they saw Witkoff and Kushner go to Moscow the last time around, and they were polite to them. And then they discovered that Kushner and Witkoff were concerned with 200,000 acres and how BlackRock and others would have control of it in Ukraine. I mean, they actually brought this up. And I think the Russians at that point figured out these people aren't serious. These people are all about self-enrichment. They're about self-aggrandizement. And these are not people that represent legitimately the American people. I think the Russians still credit us as Americans with more virtue, probably, than we deserve, given the people that govern us. But at this point, it's over. I don't think the Russians are going to pay any attention to us. I don't think the Chinese are going to pay very much attention to anything we say either. They look at what we've done with these oil tankers. Are the Chinese going to go to war with us over it? Are the Russians? No, they're not going to go to war over these vessels. But these things have now fundamentally persuaded these governments and the people that lead them that we're not a trustworthy partner. And so trying to negotiate anything with them in the future is going to be extremely difficult. And there will come a time when we will want their goodwill and we will need to negotiate with them, and it's not going to happen.
And let me just kind of tag on to that because there's unfortunately more news to talk about today. If we have been losing trust, and if we're going to need that trust one day, just because of what's happened so far and the fact that we haven't kept our word and we have been making these law of the jungle statements, et cetera, that was a big asterisk was put on, or a big exclamation point was put on it last night when President Trump came out and said, hey, by the way, how's about a $1.5 trillion defense budget? Tucker Carlson reacted pretty quickly to that. Here's what he had to say.
The president announced that he is hiking the Pentagon budget from $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion. Just announced that. That's the kind of budget that a country that anticipates a global or regional war has for its military. There's no other reason to do that. That's not a peacekeeping budget. That's a war budget, a big war budget toward a world war. Sorry.
And I want to look at two things in that, Doug. First of all, I want to look at the substance that he said. He said if you're going from 1 to 1.5 trillion in a single year, that implies you want to do something with it. Do you accept that?
Well, remember, we can't even audit the current Pentagon budget, the defense budget, or what do we call it today? The war budget, I guess. We no longer use the word defense. We can't audit it. We don't know where all the money goes. So under those circumstances, you would think that everybody on the Hill would be enraged and say, stop, until we can account for all the money we've already spent and figure out where it's actually going. We're not going to add any more. Well, they don't care about that because the money is a part of the larger self-aggrandizement machine in Washington. In other words, more money in defense means more money for constituents, more money for voters, more money for donors, and more money for the people that sit on the Hill. So I think that's really where their minds are. And it goes back to what we said earlier. I think I take Tucker's point, and I agree with him. It is a war budget in the sense of its size and scope, but people don't understand what war means. So when you tell people, well, this is a war budget, they say, what are you talking about? Well, wars involve great conflicts, massive use of firepower, the destruction of life and property. So, well, what do you mean? Well, what about the loss of people on the scale of the Ukraine war? You know, how many versions of the United States Army have perished on the ground in eastern Ukraine? If you're looking at 1.5 million dead Ukrainian soldiers or above, how many armies do you get out of that? Is that 3 armies, 4 armies that we have? It's unrealistic. These people don't know what they're doing. So I think it's more of a money scam, to be blunt, than anything else. Now, in Donald Trump's mind, I'm sure Donald Trump says, well, the fact that we're spending all this money means that we're going to be even better than we already are. In other words, we can do more operations like we saw executed in Venezuela. And he equates that in his mind to war. And you and I know that's not what it is. And at the same time, I think he also says it's deterrence. The fact that we're ready to spend all of this money that we really don't have, that we have to create from nothing out of, whole cloth, that somehow or another everyone's going to be afraid of us, and therefore they'll leave us alone. We're at some point that business of they'll be afraid of us changes into they loathe and despise us and will fight us.
Yes.
And he's been pushing us towards that limit without necessarily realizing it. I don't think he realizes it. And then, of course, his ego and the ego in Washington, and everything in Washington is mortgaged to ego, says, well, then let them be afraid. They should be. It's kind of nonsense. It's all bad. There's nothing good in it.
Yeah, and I want to look at it from a separate angle too. Something that you mentioned at the start of this show, but also have talked about several times, is that looking back over the landscape of empires in history over hundreds or thousands of years, is that overspending and overexertion has been one of the biggest problems that have caused a collapse of empires. And since we're already on shaky economic grounds, what could it possibly do to us economically if we even try to print that much more money? Because we'll have to borrow all that additional $500 billion. What do you see this doing to us economically?
Well, I just would direct everybody back to Ray Dalio and Warren Buffett and Nassim Taleb as examples, Alistair MacLeod. I mean, I can go down the list of all the financial experts, James Grant and others. Listen to what they have to say. Now, people have been listening to them for the last several years, and the answer is, well, it hasn't happened. Okay. Well, that's like saying to a terminal cancer patient who has pancreatic cancer, God forbid, and I don't wish this on anybody, but it's very difficult to survive pancreatic cancer. I mean, I don't know very many people who have. And that's kind of what we've got in financial terms. And remember that President Trump used to talk about reshoring manufacturing to get this manufacturing base back. Well, reshoring is very difficult, but you can build from scratch. You can invest a lot of money in building up your manufacturing base. You can target areas and target certain manufacturing sectors. He hasn't really done that. That's far more important than investing in the defense budget, because you're reaching a point now where the defense budget is a mile wide and an inch deep. you're prepared and capable of waging what I would call the 3 to 4 week war. And then you're out. Will the 1.5 trillion change that? Well, not based upon experience, because the focus on the Hill is what? Keep spending money on what you're already spending on. That's the money flow. Keep the money flow going. Remember that President Trump was feared in the first term because he threatened to disrupt the money flow. He was going to change where the money was going. Well, this time around, he's embraced it and said, no, I'm not only am I going to support the current money flow, I'm going to double down on it and increase it. And more money is going to go to everybody than ever before. And I'm going to be the most popular man in the United States. I think that's what he thinks. I don't think it's going to work.
No, and I think from a military perspective, that's, I mean, if my own experience with the future combat systems when I was on active duty and saw the disastrous way that was ran and the way that the military leaders tried to make this thing work, and it was an abysmal, profound failure that to this day, and that was in 2007, 2008, to this day, we still haven't fielded anything new. That is astounding. That is the level of incompetence that we have. And so now that you want to just like bring in a truck and just a dump truck and just throw more cash on top of that, I have very grave doubts that will increase our capacity in any way. What do you think?
Well, I think President Trump is now going to support this new class of bombers that Northrop Grumman wants to build. I think we'll have follow-on fighters to the F-35. We're going to see a lot of things come to fruition. And sadly, what we find every time we invest in a new super weapon is that we get fewer and fewer super weapons. And quantity is important. And again, this is something else that the Russians have demonstrated in eastern Ukraine. And this is where we've fallen down with the Ukrainians. We can't provide the materiel in the abundance that's required. We can't even provide the trained manpower that would be required. That's why we're not going to commit any forces to fight in eastern Ukraine because we can't sustain it. So I think we're on a very dangerous path. It's the wrong one. How far will we get before the financial crisis that we all fear, that we've been waiting for and watching carefully develop, hits? I don't know, but when it hits, it'll probably put the brakes on most of this. And at that stage, the question is, how do we cope? And it'll be not a question of how much more we can spend, but how much can we cut? And you're dealing with a government for whom the word cut, C-U-T, doesn't exist, because that's political death.
Well, not only does CUT not exist, but also change anything doesn't exist either. And one last thing I want to ask you about, because you are literally the subject matter expert on this. This book that you wrote here, Breaking the Failings in 1997, talked about how we could transform the military into something that would be a leap ahead in step. And of course, many of the things you talked about there are graphically on display in the Russia-Ukraine war, have been demonstrated and validated as being right, that we could have done decades ago, but we never did. What prospect do you think that if the Defense Department or War Department gets this additional money, that they'll start to make changes that make sense now for the future, as opposed to just, I think you've said in the past, just, gold plating, something we've already been doing?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's unlikely, that we're going to see any profound change. When you look at acquisition and force development and equipment, all of these things. By the way, that book was translated into Chinese. And within the last couple of days, I received something from Chaz Friedman on the PLA and the reforms that were implemented. Between this book and the one that followed it, Transformation Under Fire, the Chinese have lifted everything right out of the book. And you're seeing a PLA emerge that very much reflects the thinking and the ideas in both of these volumes. But remember that the Russians and the Chinese both understood, and I think they still understand, that you have to step back for a while. You have to re-examine what you're doing. You need an objective self-assessment. We have been unwilling to step back. And the generals and the admirals like the fact that we've never stepped back, because their argument is, well, if you do this and we have to re-examine this and change this, that's going to take years. And we have all these threats, so we have to deal with immediately. we're a nation at war, you know. Well, that's crap. You and I both know that. We're not a nation at war, except for some entities inside our country. Yeah, we've got serious problems in our society, but we're not at war with everybody on the planet. We don't need to be. But unfortunately, we've made this argument over and over and over again that you can't change. You can't do anything really fundamentally new because you're engaged in action. And what results is what we saw in our armed forces during the Second World War. We had to make changes on the fly. And that was tough. And it cost us a lot of casualties. And people don't seem to understand that. I mean, last night I was talking to somebody about our position before Pearl Harbor. And we actually implemented a draft in 1939. We had over 1 million men in the United States Army. And we had one of the largest navies in the world. But when we were struck at Pearl Harbor, we had only 7 oilers. In other words, we had only 7 ships that provided oil and fuel for the fleet. And our war plans at the beginning of Pearl Harbor, the one that was on the shelf for which we had prepared and studied and built in the Navy, that plan could not be executed because it called for the United States Navy to hurl itself across the Pacific straight at the Philippines to relieve the garrison in the Philippines. And it also called for the transport of 2 Army divisions, 30,000 men, to go with the fleet to the Philippines to relieve the Philippine garrison. Well, the 30,000 troops showed up in San Francisco. They were there, but they couldn't go anywhere because the fleet could not sustain itself across the Pacific. It didn't have the tankers, if you will, that it needed at sea. They call them oilers. It didn't have enough. They only had 7. For the kind of operation that was required, they needed 50. Okay? And they didn't have the wherewithal to protect those troops that they were transporting across the Pacific. So ultimately, months later, where did they go? They went to Australia. And they sat down there, National Guard divisions. They sat down there and trained until they could be used finally in the Pacific by MacArthur. And that comes much later, obviously. So the point is that just because you spend money, and we started spending a lot of money on defense in 1939, 40, and 41, and of course, dramatically after that, doesn't translate into anything quickly. And more important, we had allies. Real allies, not dependencies, but allies. One of them was the British Empire. And the British Empire was substantial. They could put millions of men into the field. They had a huge manufacturing base. We did everything we could during the war to destroy the British Empire. We succeeded. It doesn't exist. So who is our ally?
And let me ask you right now, and by the way, I know we're a little bit over the time. If you have to go, I understand. But if I could get one more thing out of you, what would it take for us to say, all right, if you wanted to have a $1.5 trillion budget, if you wanted to have a bigger military, how would you get that done? Because it seems to me that you would have to first, in light of what you literally just said, that we would have to say, all right, let's pull back from some of these 700 bases we have scattered around the world. And literally, and I did a video on this, I guess it was posted just this morning, to where I said, look, if our power is nowhere near what people think it is, because we're scattered to the 4 winds and the 7 seas and all this, and we have 450,000 Army, 175,000 Marines, which translates into about 75,000 actual war fighters in the Army and about 17 or 25,000 in the Marines, et cetera, against, the potential for the PLA, which has over 1 million ground troops. The Russians have 1.3 million ground troops on top of the other things that they have. And they have experience, or at least the Russians do have experience in fighting, which we don't. It seems to me you would have to retrench and maybe shut down a lot of this overseas stuff. Say, all right, for I'm going to say 5 years, maybe you'll say 10. We're going to go into a self-defense mode so that we can start reorienting, rebuilding, and training, et cetera, so that we can produce something that could actually have a chance to fight those 2 militaries, should we ever have to. How would you say that we should do it if President Trump saw this video, read your book, and said, you know what, I want that kind of military that you're talking about there. How would we do it from here?
Well, it's interesting that you bring this up, because what you said is almost verbatim what General Douglas MacArthur, as Chief of Staff of the Army, wrote in his annual report to Congress in 1930. He said the U.S. Army is spread too thinly, too many people in too many different locations. We don't have the ability to concentrate and build real warfighting power. Of course, he was ignored. We were at the beginning of the Depression. Nobody cared to hear anything about it. But then what he did is he put together a plan, which was a national mobilization plan that involved where you would get the personnel. In other words, where were you going to get the soldiers? Where would they be trained? And the kinds of things that would be required of industry. That plan was inherited by Malin Craig, who followed him as chief of staff. And Malin Craig ultimately turned over this plan to George Marshall. And that plan is ultimately implemented in 1940. So, you can do a lot of things, but you have to have the systematic professional planning and preparation that is required. We didn't have the money at the time, but we did have the professional thinking and planning. That much we got, and that saved us ultimately in terms of getting into the fight. But again, we had allies. Even though the Soviet Union was never really an ally, it was always interested in what was good for it and not much else. Nevertheless, they tied down, adversary in Europe for a very, very long time before we and the British could land on the continent and make any difference. And we took on the Japanese largely alone. But Japan's economy was only 10% the size of our own. So we got away with quite a lot. We never had to fight the millions of Japanese troops in China, the Japanese field armies, which certainly until 44, 45 were very formidable. We were lucky, and we don't ever point that out. We look at World War II and we say, well, we can do this again and again and again. We were lucky that we were able to do very much of anything, and we were very fortunate that it turned out as well as it did for us. So I don't know how you get that across, Dan. I don't know how you sober people up. It's really required. It's necessary. We need to do it, but I don't think anybody's interested in listening right now.
So let me ask you in the final question. If we don't do what you've outlined, what you've talked about in the past, and what you're suggesting here today, if we don't do that and instead we just say, yeah, let's just keep everything the way it is, bring a dump truck in of another $500 billion,
right.
What is going to happen if we end up having to fight Russia or China or some other peer adversary in the near-term future?
Well, I think what we'll do, which is our preference for a whole range of reasons, because we are a maritime and aerospace power, is that we will rely very heavily on what we hope will be silver bullet technology. In other words, we'll invest heavily in the spectacular silver bullet that promises victory. In other words, we have these gadgets. Our gadgets are the best. No one has the gadgets that we do. We're going to throw those gadgets at people and we will win. It goes back to a very famous story called Superiority by Clark, the man that invented the telecommunications satellite, Arthur C. Clarke. Also wrote part of the screenplay for 2001. And he penned this essay. Everybody should give it a read. It's very short. It's called Superiority. It's about another galaxy in the universe and a fight between two planets. And one planet puts all of its faith and confidence in the production of super bullets, super technology, and they create this sort of super weapon that they're convinced will win. The other planet is not as advanced and decides that it's going to invest in a range of capabilities and broaden its base and build a larger force. And then they go to war, and ultimately the super weapon fails. And so the planet that was not as advanced in technology turns out to be the winner because it invested more wisely in things that worked, not in things that promised to work. We invest a lot of money in the promise of supremacy if we do it, instead of investing in things that we know work. And I think there's a list in Transformation Under Fire about what you want to do. And the last thing you want is the gold-plated program. But the gold-plated program is the program everybody on the Hill loves because it promises the distribution of funds. And if you go back to the Future Combat System, when it was shut down and it produced nothing of value, and literally that's what Gates said as the head of the Defense Department at the time, he shut it down. We lost billions of dollars. I don't know how much it was. Like
20 billion.
Yeah. But nobody cared. Well, why didn't anybody care on the Hill? Because the money was spent.
Yeah.
That's what they were interested in. And one of the other losers was this Marine Corps expeditionary fighting vehicle. What a catastrophe that was. That had no chance of ever working properly. And he shut that down for the same kind of reason. We don't have anybody thinking that way right now. And frankly, Gates could have done a lot more, but he wasn't able to at the time, because remember, at the time we were at war. And so he was limited in what he could do. And that's where we are now. Oh, we can't do that. We're at war. We're at war in Venezuela. No, we're not. That's absurd. It's ridiculous. It's back to, we sent the high school football team from outside of Dallas down to the elementary school to beat the hell out of the kids down there trying to learn how to play football. We looked pretty good. That high school team was really full of itself after that.
It was. Yeah, that's about the best you can say of it. But if that high school football team goes up against a college team, might have a different outcome. And that's what we're trying to avoid. But listen, I've kept you on too long today. Thank you so much for Doug. This has been spectacular. Really appreciate this. And I still hope and I pray that somebody in the White House will finally listen to some of this and put it into action, so that people don't have to watch this video of like 5-10 years from now and lament that no one listened, and then looking at the wreckage that resulted, which is what I really fear will happen. But we can't.
There are a lot of good people that are in the Department of Defense, in the White House, in the State Department. Believe me, there are. They're just not in charge, but they're there, and they know what they're doing. And if they were given a chance, I think things would be different.
I'm sure that's the case. Well, listen, thank you very much. We really appreciate it. We appreciate you guys too. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't done that. And by the way, we're on podcast. Make sure you're aware of that. I know a lot of people don't have time to watch video, but they love to watch podcasts. Share this with your friends, because a lot of them, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podcast Addict, are all over loving that. So share that with them. And we'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive. We don't have sponsors because we hate to hit you over the head with ads. I don't like them. So show a little love back. Subscribe, like, and send this to somebody you care about.